Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and organize around the eco-socialist platform that Angela Walker and I ran on. So what's dominating the news the last few days is Trump's about to be indicted. And so what that brings to my mind is the justice system, because some people are saying, see, it works, that nobody's above the law. And, my reaction is what's taking them so long to indict Trump. But looking at what else is going on this week, Mumia Abu-Jamal was denied a new trial, even though there's good evidence. So he's on a death sentence in prison. He's got illnesses, and it looks like all avenues are closed off to him. Leonard Peltier is still in jail. And, Biden has the power of, pardon and clemency, and he hasn't used it for political prisoners like these two men. We've got the Cop City protesters who, maybe they were trespassing on property in Atlanta, but they've been charged with terrorism for their protests. And then we had this week the case of Stephen Donziger, who I've talked about. He lost his appeal to the Supreme Court to hear his case for overturning his contempt of court conviction. Now, Stephen Donziger, if you remember, won an $8.5 billion judgment against, it was Texaco, then since been taken over by Chevron, so it's against Chevron, in courts in Ecuador for Chevron polluting the land and water of indigenous people in Ecuador. And so Chevron sued in U.S. courts to get the Ecuadorian decision overturned. And they went to the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, and he refused to take the case. But they found a judge who would hand the prosecution over to Chevron. In other words, corporate prosecutors in a public justice system. And I won't go into all the details, but they basically had a kangaroo court. And at one point, they demanded that Donziger turn over his electronic devices to the Chevron prosecutors. And he refused because he was fighting this case to overturn the Ecuadorian decision. And that was, his privileged information. So he was within his rights, but the judge charged him with contempt. He ended up spending 6 months in prison. He was on house arrest for over a year. And so Donziger, has gone through the courts, and he went to the Supreme Court, and they denied, a hearing for his case. And the interesting thing is it was Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, conservative justices, who dissented in this case and said this is an abuse, having Chevron do the prosecution of the justice system. But you wonder, where the hell were the liberal justices that the Democrats appointed in this case? So that's a real setback as well. And then we have, in terms of, the justice system, this goes to immigration. And the Biden administration is putting in place policies that will continue Trump policies that were instituted under Title 41, which enabled the U.S. to summarily expel people seeking asylum and immigration because of the COVID pandemic. And, I've been saying, if you're worried about COVID, give those people vaccinations. But instead, they just threw them back across the Mexican border, or in some cases, if they got across the border, deported them to countries like Haiti, which is a very dangerous place to be returned to. So Trump has put in place the same policies in case this Title 41 is struck down in the courts, which looks like is going to happen. And so you have, thousands and thousands of people who can't get due process on the U.S. side, and they're forced to stay in Mexico until they can get a hearing. And they're supposed to use this phone app Some of them don't have phones. The phone app and that whole process is jammed, so they're waiting months and months for, their hearing. And then what we had this week was, people got upset and a fire started in one of these migrant camps and 38 people were killed. So, the justice system, yeah, it's good Trump is going to be indicted. There are other cases pending against him, but that doesn't mean we don't need a lot of improvements to the justice system. Starting with community control of the police, which we've advocated for a long time, funding public defenders at the same scale and salaries as prosecutors. Those are just two reforms that we should be advocating. And there's a lot more that needs to be done, but I will stop there. I'm sure people will want to talk about the Trump case and what else is going on. So I look forward to your questions and comments. Question 1 from Brant Gill. Do you or the Green Party have any stances on the ethics of veganism, especially given cardon emotions from animal agriculture? Not sure what cardon emotions are. Many Greens are vegans, and they urge other people to adopt that. Carbon emissions. Carbon emissions from animal agriculture. Carbon emissions is a big issue. And there's a debate going on whether, for example, in the Great Plains, whether restoring the buffalo herds would reduce carbon emissions. There's a lot of evidence for that, just in the way they deal with grazing the grasses and the carbon, or in this case, methane emissions. Cows are much more prolific than buffalo in that regard. So if you want to deal with carbon emissions, there are ways to change animal agriculture. We had a debate in the Green Party. There was a proposal to basically say the Greens oppose all animal agriculture. That was defeated pretty substantially by the National Committee. But, the debate and some of the people advocating that were saying that that was, I think they went way too far. They said that was more important than reducing carbon emissions from fossil fuels. I don't think the evidence shows that. But I would say in general, the Greens do and should promote changes to animal agriculture. We got to get rid of the concentrated animal feed operations, which lead to a lot of methane and carbon emissions, and basically restore using the land to the way animals have used it, all along, instead of with animal agriculture concentrating large herds of animals and feedlots and so forth. So, there's a lot to discuss there, both in terms of encouraging people toward veganism, or at least vegetarianism, or eating less meat, and also improving animal agriculture from emissions, greenhouse gas emissions point of view. Scout Trooper 164, should we focus on mental health, ban assault weapons, or both? We should encourage police departments to deal with many situations with social services, including mental health services, or, for example, with the homeless housing, instead of bringing in the police to treat it as a criminal problem. Being homeless is not a crime. But there are some communities that have made being on the streets and homeless a crime, and that's wrong. So that's an important focus. Instead of treating every situation as a problem, the police are trained and skilled and the right people to deal with. On the other side, banning assault weapons, I'm for banning the sale of assault weapons. These are weapons of war. I had an M16 when I was in the military, in the Marine Corps, and I would hate to see that being used by someone on the street, because it's about killing people. It's not about hunting. You use that to hunt a deer, you're not going to have much deer left. So it doesn't have that purpose. As far as banning possession, there are millions and millions, I forget the number, of these weapons out there. And I think you'd create more problems than you'd solve by forcing people to turn those weapons in. I think buyback programs should be encouraged, and selling new assault weapons should be banned. We did that for a while back at the Brady bill, and it did lead to a reduction of those kinds of homicides, with that weapon, and homicides overall. So I think that is something we should also do. So I guess my short answer is both. Sam Musto. Question: what are the advantages of a dues-paying membership party, and would that discourage people from joining? Yeah, that's a great question that's been debated in the Greens since the very beginning in the 1980s. There are really important advantages to a dues-paying membership party. I think the most important is democracy. There's then a common membership standard for all Greens, and you can apportion delegates from the various states to national committee and national conventions based on living, breathing people who are members. What we do now is take a lot of indicators of activity in the states, and there's something like 40 of them. And there's this complicated formula that comes up with a result that often is absurd. State parties that had activity and then kind of collapsed, like Texas at one point when it lost its ballot line, got a lot of delegates. And then the law changed and they got their party back and they revived. But at the time, they couldn't fill those delegations. So I think when you have one person, one vote, and proportional representation based on those memberships in the states, then you have a more democratic structure. Another advantage is finance. People should contribute to the Green Party if they're serious about it, instead of assuming other people are going to pay for your participation. I think that's something that parties all over the world do that. It's just in the United States where we have parties that are memberless, which creates problems for democracy and for grassroots financing. The memberless parties, except for the Greens, like the Democrats and Republicans, rely on corporate funding and funding from rich folks. So, and again, that's a democracy issue. Would it discourage people from joining? In my experience, people who are low income and middle income, they have no problem paying dues. It tends to be the upper middle class people that project that onto people. And you can always have a waiver for hardship. So I don't think it would discourage people from joining. I think it would encourage them because they'd see we're serious, that we expect people who want to be in the Green Party to contribute. And it's important that they do. So the other issue that comes up is whether it's legal. And this has been, people have brought that up for decades. And I have yet to see a law in any state that says you cannot have a party structure that requires dues. People in California have said that, but we know from a court case back in the 80s that to be on the Democratic Party county central committee, back then you had to pay dues. So, it wasn't proscribed in California or in any other state. What the rules about party participation in primaries or in states where they say we're not going to run a primary for you, but you have a convention, that's all the state is concerned about when it keeps track of enrollment or who to hand ballots to in open primary states. They don't care how you make your internal decisions. There are laws that don't require that you have a structure where people can't support it by dues. So that's another issue that comes up, and I think it's a canard. It's not a problem. It's not a legal obstacle to having a dues-paying membership party. The Socialist Party in the early part of the 20th century, as primaries were being introduced, kept their dues paying structure. And what they did was they would have internal conventions to nominate their candidates. If they had to put them in primaries, the party organization would support their candidates in the primaries, and they almost always won. And back in 1918, 6 members of the Socialist Party were elected to the New York State Assembly. And the Assembly refused to seat them because the Socialist Party opposed U.S. participation in World War I. And so they called for new elections, and the same socialists were elected, and they denied them being seated again. And to justify that, they came up with this monster, something like 5,000-page report on quote unquote subversive movements around the world, socialists, anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists, IWW, and they cover countries all over the world, all over Europe and Asia and Latin America. But they did have a chapter on New York. And what they said about the Socialist Party in New York is that they said they're not a party. They're not a party. They are an organization. And then they described how you had to pay your dues to be a member, to vote in their committees and conventions. And the reaction when I stumbled across that was, well, I guess the people that run this country, represented by the Democrats and Republicans in the New York State Assembly, don't want the working class to be organized. They want us to be atomized. But even in that case, they didn't claim that the Socialist Party was illegal. They just complained that it was an organization. So anyway, I think if the Green Party is going to be serious, is the way it's got to move. We need a dues-paying membership party, a mass membership party, and it'll be more democratic, and it will give us better financing. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of Biden bombing Syria after a U.S. contractor was murdered? Well, yeah, the contractor was killed when Iranian-backed militias bombed a U.S. base in Syria. And so the U.S. responded. The question is, should we have U.S. troops in Syria at all? And I don't think so. I think we should continue to provide arms to the Syracuse Democratic Forces, which are led by the left-wing Kurdish militias, but they have other members of other ethnic groups and their militias, Arab communities, Armenians, and all the ethnic groups in northeast Syria. And they're the most progressive force in Syria. So I think, and they're fighting ISIS as well as Assad. They're not really fighting Assad, but they're defending what they've set up, this very democratic, grassroots democratic, feminist democracy. And it's the most progressive force in the Middle East. It's anti-sectarian. They're not even asking for a nation state. They just want autonomy for the administration of their local affairs. And I think that's something we should support. But we don't need U.S. troops there to do that. The Kurdish forces and the Syrian Democratic Forces are very capable, and but they do need weapons. And so I'm for supplying with weapons, but I think it's time to pull the U.S. troops out because, they may be providing advice, but I think the Kurdish and Syrian Democratic Forces can take care of themselves. Scout Trooper 164. Sagar Anjali once covered the U.S. military suffering shortages after giving Ukraine aid. What are your thoughts? Yeah, the U.S. military has been geared to counterinsurgency fighting, the so-called war on terror. So it's small arms and air support, And the war in Ukraine is an old-fashioned artillery battle. So the U.S., capacity, and as well as the NATO countries, for producing the artillery shells, as well as the artillery, is limited. So the amount of weapons or munitions that the U.S. can provide to Ukraine is limited to our limited production capacity. And so the U.S. is starting to ramp up production, but it's it's not going to make a difference unless this war lasts another couple years. So that's the situation. Of course, I think Ukraine has the right to get arms from wherever they can get them to defend themselves. But they're up against munitions shortages, which there's a lot of reporting the Russians are too. So there are a lot less shells being fired by both sides in recent months, but it's still very deadly at the scale it's going on. Via email, comments on protests in Israel. Yeah, they're massive. And, the people protesting are concerned that the far right extremist government that is in power is going to use the courts to undermine democracy. Netanyahu himself is under indictment for corruption, and they're afraid that he's going to use them to get himself off the hook. And so that's good. They're fighting for democracy for Israelis. The problem is that movement really hasn't said anything about the Palestinians. If you're about democracy, you got to be about the human rights and political rights of the Palestinians. So I think that's a limitation on those protests and on politics in Israel. One of the things that may happen if Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition gets its way is they're going to ban Arab political parties in Israel, which is not democratic in the least. So that's one of the consequences if this happens. Looks like Netanyahu has got his coalition to agree to pause the takeover of the courts, but as a condition of that pause, they gave one of the far right parties, that's basically a racist party against Arabs and Palestinians, the right to establish its own militia, which is a dangerous development because that militia is going to go after the Palestinians without any restrictions that Israel at least has on paper toward the mistreatment of Palestinians. So that's a very dangerous situation. And the Palestinian resistance is turning to arms, and that they are really outgunned, and it's questionable whether that strategy is the best one. I think what we can do is get behind the BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, that the broadest supported civil society organization, the Palestine National BDS Committee, has called for. And the first thing they call for is cutting off military aid to Israel while it is violating the rights of Palestinians. And so, my thought is, the way we should relate to this is to support the U.S., demand that the U.S. cut off its military aid to Israel until it gets serious about coming to a just settlement with the Palestinians. Scout Trooper 164, the U.S. blocked the Nord Stream investigation by the UN. What are your thoughts? Yeah, I think the proposal was to have the UN do its own investigation, independent of the investigations being done by Germany, Sweden, and Norway, I believe, maybe Denmark. In any case, and those investigations are not sharing information with the Russians who they don't trust. So an independent investigation seems warranted to, try to get, some resolution as to who did this sabotage. Right now, I'm reserving judgment. I know about the Seymour Hersh article, and people have blown a lot of holes in that. There was another set of articles from leaks from U.S. intelligence and maybe German intelligence that it was a pro-Ukrainian renegade group that did it, but that has lots of holes in it. So I don't know who did it, and I'm waiting to see more information, more evidence, and I would think an independent investigation sponsored by the UN would be a good idea. So I think this proposal came from the Russians, which may be why the U.S. opposed it, just sort of on principle, which is not a good principle. You got to look at each proposal on its own merits. So I would be for an independent UN investigation. Scout Trooper 164. Elon Musk apparently admitted he lost $20 billion to the Twitter deal. Your thoughts? Yeah, Elon Musk, it's like us losing, the change we have in our pocket. He's so super rich. But I don't know what else to say. I mean, I think he's a hypocrite on Twitter in terms of who gets sanctioned. And he puts out a lot of nonsense on his own tweets. I think it brings up the larger question of how do we regulate social media platforms. And, the thing, and I talked about this a little last week, is what we need is not to scapegoat TikTok in congressional hearings or, go after Twitter because Elon Musk owns it. What we need is a policy that protects our personal information and our privacy. And the EU has this. It says that this information is our property, not the property of the social media platforms. And I think that's one thing we definitely need to do. And then some of these platforms are natural monopolies. And it tends to happen in these, what do they call them, network platforms, where people want to be where everybody else is. So Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, they become basically monopolies. And monopolies are the classic case where you want, social ownership and public regulation. So there's a question of whether some of these platforms should be public utilities instead of private for-profit corporations. So, anyway, I'm not shedding any tears over the 20 billion Elon Musk lost. He's got a lot more billions where that came from. Scout Trooper 164, repeal the Restrict Act. It does anything but ban TikTok. I'm not familiar with that act, and I'm not sure what it does, so I really can't comment more on that. Advik Ranjan, hope I pronounced that right. What do you feel about the rise of socialists in America and Bernie Sanders? On the whole, I'm positive about it. Bernie did not run away from the socialist label when it was reminded that he had called himself a socialist when he ran for president in 2016. And people liked what Bernie was saying. It really wasn't socialism, in the sense of public ownership of a major means of production and democratic planning. It was more support for the kind of New Deal liberal programs that the U.S. welfare state had, and in Europe they have to a greater extent. But people it was very popular with people. And then they were saying, well, if that's socialism, I guess I'm for socialism, which opened up a whole debate. And I think that's good. It has made socialism not a dirty word, but a word that we should have a discussion about. So I think that's all positive. My criticism is that, classically socialism has been for independent, class independence of the working class in terms of politics and organizing. And much of this new socialism has went into the Democratic Party, where it makes the Democratic Party look better than it is, and it has no strength. It's on the margins. It's the tail on the Democratic donkey, um, which eviscerates socialism as a political force, in my opinion. I think we'd be much stronger if we advance socialist policies independent of the two major corporate parties or capitalist parties. Then we would get a clear difference between what those parties offer, when corporate neoliberalism for the Democrats, neo-fascism for the Republicans now, and what democratic socialism is. So those are some of my feelings about what is going on since Sanders revived the word socialism. Although I'll give a little credit to Fox News, because they were calling Barack Obama a socialist when he was in office. And a lot of his supporters were saying, well, if that's socialist, maybe I'm a socialist too. So this is overall a good development because it opens up the scope of political debate, legitimate political debate in this country. Scout Trooper 164, why do we still look at Bernie Sanders as an example of socialism? It's sad when people don't look beyond him, when he's just what liberalism from the 1940s is or was and is now called socialism. Yeah, it's I think we look at Bernie that way because there are no socialists who have a more radical vision of socialism who have the platform that he does. So people, they hear Bernie and they say, okay, that's if that's socialism, I'm for it. But they don't hear from socialists that really do want to, take the power from the large corporations. Now, I've known Bernie since the early 1970s, and in his private mind, he wants to do that too. He just thinks politically he needs to campaign around particular policies, and I'm fine with that. The fight for reforms is the part of the way we get people engaged and have them understand why the system needs to be changed. The problem is it gets called socialism when it's a much watered down version of what socialism ought to be. And I see Chris put in the chat article I wrote early in the 2020 campaign, Sanders socialism is old-fashioned liberalism, which is a statement of fact, and as well as the article is a critique. So you might want to look at that. Via email, are you going to read Bernie's new book? I guess I will when I get to it. I've got so many more. I've got my books in a shopping cart, and I got a budget, so it's April 1st, so I can spend some more money this month. But Bernie's book is not in it. There are a number of other books that I think I'll read before I get to that one, if I ever do. And I think I know what's on that list. There's a book on imperialism by Gilbert Achcar, who's a longtime independent socialist. I've been busy on other things, but I can look it up and tell you. It'll just be a second. Here we go. Okay, what I got in my cart is, and I'm not sure, this is another one kind of like Bernie's book, I'm not sure I'll get to. It's by Vivek Chibber. It's from the Jacobin folks, called Confronting Capitalism. And it's kind of a primer short book. Now, this one I definitely am interested in reading. It's How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century. It's the last book by Eric Olin Wright, who's written a lot of good things on socialism and how to practically advance it in our era. And then the other book is No Miracles Needed by Mark Jacobson, who is the Stanford engineer who has been one of the leading advocates for 100% clean energy on a fast timeline. He wrote a book or an article, and then there were academic articles based on it back in Scientific American back in 2009, where he said at that time the whole world could be powered by wind, water, and sun by 2030. And he has a solutions project which has shown how that can be done. He pushed back the deadline. He's done it for many states and many countries to 2050. And in New York, we were drawing a lot on his material when I ran for governor, calling for a Green New Deal and 100% clean energy in 10 years. And he said it's not for technical or economic reasons why the deadline is pushed back in these solution projects studies. It's political, that he and his team felt they couldn't get the Democrats, who are the ones that might have the power to do it, to go for such a past timeline. But I still advocate, based on his information, the faster timeline. And this book is subtitled "How Today's Technology Can Save Our Climate and Clean Our Air." And looking at the table of contents, this is the kind of information I will find useful just in public debates. So where's the table of contents here? Okay, what problems are we trying to solve? WWS solutions for electricity generation. WWS meaning wind, water, and solar or sun. WWS solutions for electricity storage, solutions for transportation, solutions for buildings, solutions for industry. These are all different chapters. Solutions for non-energy emissions, like steel making. What doesn't work, electricity grids, and it goes on, but this is written for a popular audience. He has a textbook that came out recently that I've been using as reference that covers these same topics. But I'm looking forward to reading this more popular presentation. So that's what I got in the works. And currently, books I'm reading are a book on by a woman who's an anthropologist who hung out with leftists in Ukraine before and during the Maidan Revolution, which is very revealing about what they tried to do, the struggles they had against the far right elements that were violent toward them, and it gives a good picture of what happened in that revolution and the left's role in it. I'm also reading a book by SamFarber on Che, which is very interesting. Farber is a Cuban by birth and a critic of the one-party state in Cuba. He's a socialist, and his criticisms of Che are basically that Che was not really a Democrat. He's pretty elitist, and that's reflected in kind of the voluntarism of his efforts in the Congo and Bolivia, where he was killed, to foment insurgencies without building a popular base. And then he goes into, kind of Che's sort of bohemian, elitist sensibilities. It's an interesting book. So that's what I've been reading and plan to read. Advik Ranjan. What will you think may run USA better, Trump or Biden? Well, Biden's better than Trump, but he's not what we need. It's kind of, do you want to be tortured to death? That's Trump. Or do you want to be just shot quickly? That's Biden. It won't be as painful. But Biden, he just opened up for auction an area of the Gulf of Mexico the size of Italy for gas and oil drilling, when we need to keep that stuff in the ground and spend all our money in the energy field on renewables. And I just mentioned his terrible policies at the border. I mentioned a bunch of problems with the justice system, and Biden is doubling down on funding police departments from the federal level. He's moving to the right. He's getting ready to run for re-election, and he figures he can take the left for granted and go after votes in the center and the center right, especially against the far rightists like Trump or DeSantis. I guess I'll say Biden's a lesser evil, but he's still evil, and we need an alternative to both. Frankie Lee, Howie, who with common sense can take control and prevent using shells with depleted uranium on the Donbass? Man. The depleted uranium is in the munitions, particularly munitions that would be aimed at piercing armor, like anti-tank munitions. And it's in the arsenals of the US, Russia, many of the NATO countries. And there's been a campaign since we've learned of the horrific consequences of using those depleted uranium munitions in Yugoslavia and Iraq. And what happens is when the uranium pierces, it explodes, you create a dust. And it's not so much the radioactivity, that's outside your body, because it's alpha radiation and your skin stops that. It's when you ingest it by inhaling or ingesting it with food or water that it gets in your body. And when it, gets lodged in a cell, like in your lungs, and that alpha radiation, that can cause mutations and cancer. But bigger than the radiation is the chemical contamination. Uranium, this depleted uranium is toxic to the body, like lead and other heavy metals can create problems in your body. And what we've seen in Yugoslavia and Iraq, particularly around Basra and Fallujah, is skyrocketing birth defects, miscarriages, and cancers. And it seems most of these are caused by the toxic chemical pollution that this depleted uranium creates, not so much the radiation, although the radiation is still dangerous if it's ingested. So, common sense would be that the US and Russia and the other big military powers get with this program to ban depleted uranium weapons, which has been a international campaign going around for, almost 2 decades now. And, you say who? The people with the common sense are the people that are in this campaign. Leaders of these countries, I don't know of any that are, except, small countries in the global south that don't have big militaries are, on board with this ban on depleted uranium weapons. But it's something we need to start raising and making demands about. And unfortunately, Russia is already using depleted uranium. This issue came up when the UK said it would be in their munitions to go along with their tanks they're sending to Ukraine. And it's in the, stock of US munitions, although I think what the U.S. response was, we're not saying if they're there, but we're not opposing the U.K. sending those munitions. So Ukraine is going to suffer the consequences, and it's sad. Scout Trooper 164, Zelensky invited China's Xi to Ukraine. What do you think of this? I think it's, what Zelensky should be doing. And it's interesting, Xi's peace proposal recognizes that all nations have a right to territorial integrity and non-interference, which would implicitly criticize Russia's invasion. On the other side, they urge the U.S. to stop sending arms to Ukraine. They seem to be straddling the fence that was not so much a peace proposal as a statement of China's values on this. What I found most interesting recently is that when Xi was in Moscow with Putin, they came out with a joint statement where they said we oppose putting uh, nuclear weapons on other countries' territories. And 1 week after that meeting ended, Putin did that by saying he's going to put tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. I imagine Xi is not happy about that. So I think, it's smart on Zelensky's part to have kept this door open and want to talk with China. Ukraine has actually, before this war started, a lot of trade with China going both ways. So that's something else they need to talk about. But a settlement to the war. So I think, it's positive, and, let's see what comes out of it. I think China's got Russia by the balls. Russia's much smaller economically, in terms of population. They have the natural resources. Now they got to sell them at a discount to China because of the sanctions against Russia. So China is benefiting greatly. Now, the other side of it is, China sees both Russia and the U.S., they're, competitors, spending a lot of resources, and the West, NATO as well, spend a lot of resources on this war in Ukraine, while China, is benefiting economically. So, that's the side of that may, push Xi to really not try to intervene in this and just let it go on while China benefits. But on the other hand, China wants stability. Their Belts and Roads Initiative, goes through Ukraine to Western Europe, and they don't like instability for that project. So, China has reasons to support peace and reasons maybe to let it go, the war go on. But I don't see any negatives coming from Zelensky and Xi talking. So I'm glad to see. And I guess the latest thing I heard is, Xi is open to having that talk. So hopefully it will happen soon. MOG, shouldn't the Green Party be messaging about the health crisis caused by environmental pollution and connecting that to the train derailment, labor, corporate privatization, and corrupt government? Absolutely, we should. And we should be doing more than we're doing. We're doing some of that. I've, tweeted out that, we need to bring the railroads under public ownership and democratic control so that we can take care of these safety, labor, and environmental issues that the corporations running the railroad companies are responsible for, because they're really squeezing the equipment and the staffing, the labor, squeezing profits out of that. And then they had the highest profit rate of any industry last year in the U.S. And instead of reinvesting that in, better wages and working conditions for labor and better safety, and improving the rail infrastructure, they're spending a lot of it on stock buybacks to juice up the price of their stocks, which top management as well as their big investors own. So, yeah, I think we should be doing. We have been, but we can always do more, and I would advocate that on that messaging. Scout Trooper 164, isn't it quite tragic that there have been 100 shootings by the time it's only reached March? You mean mass shootings, because we have shootings every day and homicides every day. Yeah, it's tragic. It's inexcusable. We got a huge problem here, and while the mass shootings get the attention, it's the everyday shootings that go on. People get mad, they grab a gun and they shoot somebody, and usually regret it afterwards. But that's where we're at. And we just had a study come out here in my city of Syracuse. We have a huge problem with gangs. There are 15 gangs in this city of 150,000 almost. About 1,250 gang members have been identified, and they are, the youth shooting rate in this city is the highest of any in the country. And these are not about controlling drug dealing turf or anything like that. It's basically Hatfield versus McCoy, old beefs. And these gangs are just at war with each other. And it's a cycle of revenge. And so, we've had 400 homicides in the last few years. I forget the time frame for that, but it's about an average of 30 a year in this small city, which ranks it pretty high per capita among all cities in the country. And part of that is, easy availability of illegal handguns. That's mostly what's used. Some of them are legally purchased, but these youths get hold of them, and it's just, I guess you could say tragic. It's also, inexcusable. So what they're proposing to do in Syracuse, and we're getting the expected pushback, is what they did in Richmond, California, under the Green mayor at that time, Gail McLaughlin, where they got a new police chief in there who focused on community policing and having officers get out of their cars and onto the streets and bikes and get to know the people in communities they were now assigned to, in order to be able to preempt, shootings. The same gang problem there in Richmond that they have here in Syracuse, same type of gang problem. And they reduced homicides. That city is, I think it's about 100,000, if I remember right. And they had homicides of about 40, about the size of Syracuse in a smaller city, but one of the highest in the country, if not the highest. And over the 8 years of this program, they reduced the homicides down to, a handful. I think it was 6 the 8th year. And they also had a program where they paid the youth in these gangs a stipend per month. I think it was $1,000 per month in Richmond, that they would get if they stayed out of trouble, which gave them, good incentive to get out of the gang fights. And they're proposing to do that based on the experience of Richmond and another city, I forget which one, where they've done this. But of course, you got these law and order people getting on their high horse saying, we shouldn't be paying money to criminals and bribing them to do good. But you're talking about youth who are in very desperate situations, a lot of times broken families. The gang is really their family. It's where they get, respect and mutual support. And, somebody else has got to show them some love. So that's what this program is designed to do. And I'm not sure it's going to, go through here in Syracuse. It should. But what I'm saying is it's not just the mass shootings. It's the constant, homicides. A lot of them, gang banging, but a lot of them just crimes of passion, where if people had cooled off, they wouldn't have done them. And because the guns are so handy, they use them, and it leads to tragic consequences. So, our homicide rates, our mass shooting rates in this country are off the charts compared to other countries. And it's really sick and sad that, you can't get Congress to address this, because particularly the Republicans, are afraid of the gun lobby, the National Rifle Association. And, that speaks to why we got to reform our political system, so these, corporate sponsored candidates don't dominate and get elected from gerrymandered districts that are non-competitive. So there are a lot of things this problem raises that we've got to address. Vicky Corden, since corporations are considered people and money is considered speech, the Supreme Court did this and is hurting average people. It has to be reversed. Supreme Court is too political. Yeah, absolutely. There is an amendment to address that. It's called the We the People Amendment to the Constitution. And it would say define corporations as artificial creations, not like people with natural rights, and would say money is not speech, it's property. And that would enable, if that amendment passed, for Congress to regulate money in elections in much more robust way than we do now, even to ban private money in elections and have a fully publicly financed election system. Like actually Biden had in his online platform in 2020, which is something he and some other members of the Senate supported in the 1990s. There was legislation to do that. And it's kind of died away. I think it's interesting. I would love to ask Biden if he knew that was in there and if it's just a carryover from old platforms he had. But of course, the way it was qualified in that platform was that if we can't get that passed, we'll pass, the kind of regulations that were in HR 1 that, I talked about a lot last year, which were campaign finance reforms that would have created more transparency, but also made the public financing system that we do have for presidential elections harder to access, impossible for the Green Party. So, that legislation had a lot of good things in it, but that part we criticized. In any case, Biden, he said he would, bring legislation to the Congress to ban private money in public elections. He didn't do that, like he didn't do a lot of the other things he said he would do. But meanwhile, there's this We the People Amendment. People should Google that, see what it says, see who the sponsors are, and thank them, and then, lobby your own member of Congress to get on that bill. There's been a campaign for that for a couple decades now, and it's kind of a perennial issue on the liberal left and the radical left, for that matter. But we haven't been able to advance it in Congress, even when the Democrats had control. But it's something we need to keep educating and advocating for. Scout Trooper 164. How do you believe we should challenge Blackstone from taking people's homes and extending rent? You mean increasing rent, I think. I think, we should consider socializing the holdings of Blackstone. What they did was buy up a lot of rental housing and homes that people had to abandon, couldn't keep up with the mortgage after the 2008 housing and financial crisis. And they bought them on the cheap, and now they're the biggest landlord in the country. And there hasn't been a lot of affordable housing built, so they're just, raising the rent to whatever they can extract from the people. And, what we need is, maybe the public to take over these large landlords. In the city of Berlin, there was actually a referendum to do that. And it was an advisory referendum, so it hasn't been enacted into law. This is Berlin in Germany. But that's the kind of thing we should be doing, as well as, calling for a greatly expanded public housing program. Public housing accounts for less than 1% of our housing in this country, compared to the countries in Western Europe where it's, double digits, often 20 or 30% of all the housing that's available. And what that does is give people an affordable option. It drives down rents in the private sector as well. That's where we need to go. One thing we got to do is to repeal the Faircloth Amendment, which passed under the leadership of Bill Clinton and the former governor of New York when he was head of HUD, Andrew Cuomo. And what that amendment says is that we can't build any more public housing units, or we can only build them if other units are torn down, which is just a gift to the private developer and real estate industry and landlords, and should be repealed so we can expand public housing. It should be a major, there's two major things we need to do right now to make rental housing affordable. One is federal rent control, like we did during World War II, particularly in this period of high inflation and the concentration of ownership of rental housing by these investment firms like Blackstone. So rent control, and the other thing is to expand public housing. So we have a lot of public affordable housing in the market because the public housing is cheaper to build per unit than when you build it on a for-profit basis, and they operate at cost. So you just want as much rent as you need to maintain the properties, not to add on a profit. And that creates a yardstick against which the private sector has to compete. And so I think that's what we should be doing about the housing crisis: public housing and rent control. So that's the signal that our hour is up. I've enjoyed your questions and your comments, and there's so much we need to do, and we're not getting solutions from Biden, and we got these neo-fascist crazies in the Republican Party waiting in the wings. I think I would predict that they're going to get their butts handed to them in 2024. What they're proposing is unpopular, except with a minority of the American electorate. It may be 30%, but it's not enough to win, which is why the real danger from these far-right people is violence. And Trump is trying to instigate that with his comments about getting indicted. So I'm more worried about that than their long-term electoral success. In any case, that doesn't mean Biden and the Democrats are an answer, and we need to keep organizing and building the Green Party. And as I always advocate, do it from the bottom up. We can win local elections. We need to win a lot more of them and create a foundation for winning state, legislative, and House elections in the House of Representatives. And when we can do that, we will become part of the mainstream political dialogue in the media. We will be able to run presidential candidates who cannot be ignored. So I think what we need to do is pretty clear, and I hope people are working on that. So we'll be here next week at the same time, and I look forward to seeing you then. Take care.